We're going to look at how to do complex numbers and talk about how to use the operations of addition, subtraction, and multiplication with them. So they are very similar to what you would do with variables. And just like numbers and numbers with variables can't be combined together, well, complex numbers, real numbers, and imaginary numbers can't be combined together either. So we're going to look at a couple examples. We're going to look at B and C on exercise 1. And you want to combine like terms. In this case, 8 and 12 would be your numbers. In that case, that would be 20. And then 4i and negative I would be positive 3i. Because again, negative I would be negative 1. Look out for in the case of subtraction, because you got to change the signs. So it's kind of like you're distributing a negative 1. So this would become 5 and 3i. And then you would have negative 1 times 2, which is negative 2, and negative 1 times negative 7, which would be positive 7i. So in this case, 5 minus 2 is 3. 3i and 7i would be 10i. So we're going to look at a couple now that deal with multiplication. And if you take a look at the bottom in exercise 3. So if we look at A, you're going to want to distribute. And again, you're doing double distribution because you got 2 terms in the first parenthesis and 2 terms in the second. So you want to multiply those out and combine like terms. So you got 3 and 7 is 21. 3 times 2i is 6i. 5i and 7i would be 35i. And 5i and 2i is going to end up being 10i squared. Now the one thing to look out for, we've talked about this before in the last assignment, I squared is equal to number negative 1. So 10i squared is actually going to be 10 times negative 1, which would be negative 10. So I'm going to rewrite this, and that 10i squared will end up being negative 10. So I'm going to have a negative 10 that I'm going to put here. And I can combine those terms together, so I'd have 11 plus 41i. And again, I'm just trying to look through and combine like terms. The i's can combine and the whole numbers can combine. So same thing, we look at B, we got negative 2 times 3, which is negative 6. Negative 2 times negative 2i would be positive 4i. I'm going to write these all horizontal. 6i and 3 would be 18i. And then 6i and negative 2i would be negative 12i squared. So again, I squared is negative 1. So for this part, we'd have negative 12 and negative 1, which would end up being 12, positive 12. We have the negative 6, and then we can combine these two together, which would be 22i. And I can still combine these two together, which would be 6, positive 6. So this is going to be 6 plus 22i. Now going to the back of this page, similar to what we've talked about before. If you look at exercise 5, now this one has multiple operations in it. You have a couple multiplication going on, and then you have the addition in the middle. So you want to do the multiplication first, just by order of operations. And you also want to keep track of all the terms. So in this case, we get 5 times negative 3, which is negative 15. 5 times I would be positive 5i. 2i and negative 3 would be negative 6i. 2i and I would be positive 2i squared. And then we got 4i times 2 and 4i times 3i. So 4i times 2 would be 8i. And 4i times 3i would be positive 12i squared. So I'm going to change the ones with the I squared. So I'm going to change those to the 2 times negative 1. So this would be negative 2. 12i squared would be negative 12. I'm going to rewrite the rest of the other terms. So I'm going to combine together my I values. So I got 5, negative 6, and 8, which would be 7i. And then we have negative 15, negative 2, and negative 12, which would be negative 29. Now, generally, the form is going to be a plus bi form. So the real numbers first, and the imaginary numbers second, which is why I wrote it like so. Now, in the case of exercise 6, well, which one of these would be a purely real number? Well, that's going to be the one that's going to have a conjugate pair. So if you look at choice 3, this one is going to be the one that's going to be a real number, because what happens is those imaginary values eliminate each other. So if you are to multiply this out, you end up with 25 plus 10i minus 10i. And then you have the negative 4i squared, which will become positive 4. So what we end up with in this case is 25. The 10 and the negative 10 cancel out, so we just end up with 25 plus 4, which would just be 29. And we'll see a little bit more of that later on when we talk about rational numbers and rational expressions dealing with imaginary values. So, as you're looking at the questions on the next page, just remember that when we're talking about complex numbers, they do behave a lot like numbers and variables and how we can combine them together and what parts can be combined. And also when you multiply, exponents do change when you multiply. But look out for that, like I mentioned earlier, look out for that I squared that you're going to come across, because that's going to be replaced by a negative 1. And we'll change the sign on that number.